Choroid plexuses. Choroid plexuses are the structures that produce cerebrospinal fluid, and they are located in the walls of the ventricles. This is the lateral ventricle. Both lateral ventricles will have choroid plexuses positioned on their inner curve on the inside. The third ventricle will have choroid plexuses positioned continuous with the lateral ventricles, even through the aperture right here on the superior wall. The fourth ventricle choroid plexuses are not continuous with the lateral and third ventricle plexuses. They're separate and they're located in the posterior wall of the fourth ventricle. Choroid plexuses are made out of capillaries and ependymal cells. So here's how choroid plexus looks like. It's made out of little blood vessels, and there's lots of them. This is the inside of the blood vessels containing blood. The blood vessels are, all of the blood vessels in the body are made out of the endothelial cells with blood inside. This is the smallest blood vessel that we can have in the body. The smallest blood vessels are called capillaries. Okay. There's is the connective tissue of the pia mater, the thinnest layer of the brain. Here's pia mater as well. Remember, pia mater contains the blood vessels, so it kind of like attaches the blood vessels in a way to the surface of the brain so they can be in close contact with the surface of the brain. So pia mater holds the blood vessels to the brain. Okay. On the outside of the pia mater, so this is going to be pia mater. On the outside, there's going to be these green, well, they're not really green, but they're colored here in this view, cells. They are called ependymal cells. So each of these cells is ependymal cell. They have a nuclei in them. And what these cells do is that they produce and cerebrospinal fluid will be right here in this white space. So what these ependymal cells do is they filter cerebrospinal fluid through themselves, or they filter the blood through themselves and only leave certain substances out. So when they filter cerebrospinal fluid through themselves back into the blood plasma, they take waste and unnecessary solutes that are located in the cerebrospinal fluid and filter that through themselves and place it into the blood. Okay, and they leave out all the good stuff in cerebrospinal fluid. They let it stay there. And then they can also take blood plasma and filter it, kind of like suck it into themselves and then spew it out on the other side. And they can only do only certain substances like this. So what they do is they take the glucose from the blood, the oxygen from the blood, the vitamins from the blood, and various ions like sodium, chloride, and magnesium, and they filter it through themselves and place it into their cerebrospinal fluid, because cerebrospinal fluid will also help nourish the brain, and it has to have some of the good stuff that's available to the brain. So basically the point of this is a choroid plexus. It's a combination of capillaries and ependymal cells. That capillaries bring blood full of nutrients and oxygen, and ependymal cells are able to filter it through themselves and take water from the blood and glucose, oxygen, vitamins, and ions and make cerebrospinal fluid out of that. So here's another diagram showing how this choroid plexus works. This is the space inside of the subarachnoid space with CSF, with the cerebrospinal fluid. It is lined with, so this could be like a ventricle. Okay, this is a ventricle, and these are the ependymal cells of the choroid plexus. So it's choroid plexus epithelial cells or ependymal cells, same thing. So there's several types of these ependymal cells. This is the ependymal cells of the choroid plexus, and this is the blood vessels inside of the pia mater. So these special choroid plexus cells are able to take blood plasma and make CSF from them, from the blood plasma. So because CSF is made from the blood plasma, it needs to be returned back into the blood plasma. So CSF is made from the red blood vessels from the arteries, become CSF, and then is returned into the veins to the blue blood vessels. So the brain has a blood circulation around it, but it also has the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid around it. And here's a review of the arteries that supply blood to the brain. So from the heart, the blood goes to these blood vessels that we reviewed earlier, the common carotid arteries on the right and the left side. And then common carotid arteries, when they reach approximately the jawline, so just a little bit above the voice box, they actually split into two branches. One branch is called internal carotid artery, and the second branch becomes external carotid artery. The internal carotid artery will enter the skull and supply the brain with blood, and the external carotid artery will stay on the surface of the skull and supply the muscle and skin and the structures of the face. So here's a view from the lateral side, like we saw the veins earlier, and showing all of these blood vessels that supply blood to the brain. So first of all, the biggest blood vessel that brings blood to the brain from the systemic circulation is called common carotid artery. This common carotid artery we have right and left. This is the right side. It travels along the windpipe. It reaches the level of the voice box, and it splits into two branches, the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery will go into the skull. You can see it becoming kind of like more faint because it's projection of the artery in the skull. And then it's going to split into many branches supplying various parts of the brain. And the external carotid artery will stay on the surface of the skull. It will also split into several branches supplying various parts of the external surface of the skull. Additional artery that supplies the brain is called vertebral artery. There's also two of them on the right and left side. This is the right vertebral artery. It is a smaller artery than the carotid artery. It travels through the spine, travels through the vertebra, and it enters the skull through the foramen magnum. The internal carotid artery enters the skull through the internal carotid foramen. It's a hole in the skull specifically for this artery, and the vertebral artery enters the skull together with the spinal cord through the foramen magnum, and it supplies kind of like the back portion of the brain primarily. So the brain receives blood supply from the right and left common carotid artery, then from right and left internal carotid arteries that enter the skull through the carotid foramen, and also through the right and left vertebral arteries that travel along the cervical vertebra of the spine and enter the skull through the foramen magnum. Here's a view of the vertebral artery to show you how it transverses the vertebra of the neck. These are the vertebra of the neck: C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7. This is going to be T1, the first thoracic vertebra. So there's 7 neck vertebra. And the transverse processes of each vertebra, they have little holes in them. These holes are called transverse foramen. And this is the hole for the vertebral artery to pass through before it enters the skull through the foramen magnum. So it's going to be happening on both sides, the right and left side. So vertebral artery goes through the vertebra like the thread through a needle, and then it enters the skull through the foramen magnum. The right and left vertebral arteries merge as they enter the skull and become basilar artery that will supply the brain tissue. And here's the underside of the skull to show you how many holes the underside of the skull actually has. The name of the holes is foramina for plural or foramen for singular, and the largest one is the foramen magnum. Just to orient you, this is the back of the skull, this is the front of the skull. We're looking at the upper teeth, the upper palate, the roof of the mouth, because the lower jaw is removed to show you the structures. And you can see these are the nostrils, the internal nostrils that provide the connection from the nasal cavity to the mouth. And then we have lots of little holes. These holes are to accommodate nerves and the blood vessels that enter the brain. And the most important ones are going to be foramen magnum. That's for the spinal cord to connect to the brain, also for the vertebral arteries to enter the brain. Then there's going to be carotid foramen, so lateral and anterior to the foramen magnum. These are the occipital condyles of the skull. This is where the first vertebra, the C1, and the skull join together. They're forming the occipital atlanto-occipital joint that allows us to nod yes. So to orient you a little bit here, so lateral to the occipital condyles and slightly anterior, there's carotid foramen on both right and left side, and posterior to the carotid foramen, there's a larger foramen called jugular foramen. So carotid artery enters the skull through the carotid foramen. The internal carotid artery enters the skull through the carotid foramen. The vertebral artery enters the skull through the foramen magna, and the jugular vein exits the skull through the jugular foramen. There's also lots of nerves that exit the skull through this foramen, so it's larger, not only because the blood vessel is larger, so the jugular vein is actually larger than carotid artery, but it also, because the hole is bigger, is also because of the nerves that exit the skull together with this vein. And of course we also have vertebral vein. Vertebral vein exits the skull through the foramen magnum as well. There's lots of other foramina. There's foramen ovale, spinosum, lacerum, stylomastoid, external acoustic meatus, that's the ear holes, and so many more. Those are for various nerves that we will study later. And here is a view showing the complete blood supply of the brain. So showing the blood supply to the brain, so the blood brought to the brain by the arteries. So first we have, I'm going to show you only on this side of the brain. So this is the left side of the brain. Left side of the body, and this is going to be the common carotid artery, brings blood to the brain. It splits into the external and internal carotid artery. Internal carotid artery enters the skull through the carotid foramen, then it curves like this under the brain and splits into so many different branches that bring blood to various brain parts. The vertebral artery traverses the spine through the transverse foramina, then it enters the skull through the foramen magnum from both sides. It merges into the one artery called basilar artery that supplies the front of the brainstem, and it splits and actually merges with some of the branches of the carotid artery too. The brain is a oxygen hungry organ. It is very, very active. It needs lots of energy to produce electrical impulses by the neurons, so we can think, we can breathe, we can move our body. Even when we're completely idle, the brain consumes 20% of all of the body's oxygen from the bloodstream, just necessary for maintaining the basic body functions. If the brain doesn't receive a sufficient amount of oxygen, we can pass out, we can faint, like lose our consciousness. And I need more coffee to talk better. But sometimes if you like get up too quickly, you might feel like you get like dizzy and you had everything go like black in front of your eyes, and that is because there was a momentary cutoff of the blood supply to the brain by getting up too quickly. So if you get up too quickly, what's going to happen is that the gravity will pull blood down. You're going to move your body up, and that's going to kind of like pull the blood away from the brain a little bit, and the brain will not receive a sufficient amount of oxygen in that split second, and you're going to feel like everything kind of like went black, like you got like this you're almost about to pass out, or you can actually faint from that, especially if you're anemic. If you don't have enough iron in your blood, that means you don't have enough blood carrying cells called red blood cells, and that's going to be affecting you even more. If the brain does not receive a sufficient amount of oxygen for a prolonged amount of time, it could go into a stroke. So stroke is when a brain doesn't receive blood to a particular brain part, and a stroke can happen for two reasons. The stroke could happen because there is a blockage in a blood vessel. So this is showing that there is a blockage in a blood vessel, and it's not letting the blood cells, the red blood cells that carry blood, get in further to feed the brain tissue with oxygen. This could happen because of a person poor diet throughout life. This is caused by high cholesterol. This is the plaque buildups inside of the blood vessels. And when the brain is not receiving the blood, it's not receiving the oxygen, it's called an ischemic stroke. Ischemic means when the body part is not receiving blood for whatever reason, it's not receiving oxygen. And you can see that the brain tissue starts to die. It starts to turn kind of like brownish here. Another reason why a stroke could happen if the blood vessel ruptured. You can see this arrow showing the blood leaking out of the blood vessel. When the blood vessel ruptures, there's going to be bleeding around the brain, and it's called the hemorrhagic stroke. So if the blood vessel is ruptured, the brain is not going to receive enough blood because it's going to be leaking out. In addition, that's going to create pressure around the brain, which is very dangerous for the brain tissue. If it's under pressure, it's going to start to die too. A stroke needs to be addressed very quickly. It's a medical emergency. Some of the signs of stroke is when the side of the face droops. Like, it's usually unilateral. That means only on one side, because a lot of times, so the way our brain controls our body is that one side of the brain, like say the right side of the brain, controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So a lot of times one of the sides of the brain only will be affected, and the symptoms of the stroke will be unilateral. For example, one side of the face will droop. Here's the right side of the face is drooping. That means the person is experiencing stroke. In the left side of the brain, part of the face might feel numb too. There will be speech difficulties if the stroke is affecting a speech area of the brain. Muscle weakness on one side of the body. Okay, so stroke is a medical emergency. If it's not addressed, the person could die or become severely brain damaged from the stroke. And here's a little diagram how to spot a stroke. You need to act F-A-S-T, fast. F stands for face, drooping. A stands for the arm, weakness, one arm only. S stands for the speech difficulty or slurring. And T stands for time. You gotta call 911 right away. Because if the stroke is addressed quickly, the person's life and brain could be saved, or at least it will help the stroke to not progress further. To avoid getting a stroke, you gotta live a healthy lifestyle. You gotta exercise, eat well, avoid foods high in saturated trans fats such as fried foods, greasy foods. Avoid weight gain. People who are obese are more susceptible to stroke. And if you're going to be taking my course 142, we're going to talk about the diet and the cardiovascular system a little bit more. Okay. The neurons also do not have the ability to store glucose. Glucose is the second most important chemical necessary for energy production by the brain. The brain takes glucose and oxygen and makes energy from that through a series of chemical reactions. Because neurons do not have the ability to store glucose, they need to constantly receive the glucose from the bloodstream. Diabetes is a disease that affects the glucose metabolism in the body. There are several types of diabetes. The most common type is diabetes type 2. This is the type of diabetes that people can acquire because of the unhealthy lifestyle and, most importantly, weight gain. The diabetes affects the blood sugar. So this is how it works. There's a hormone in our body called insulin. Insulin is depicted here in green, in yellow. And there's a chemical that we eat. It's a sugar called glucose. It's indicated in green. We need glucose to make energy. So when we eat glucose, it goes into our stomach and intestines, and from there it goes into our bloodstream. When the glucose is in our bloodstream, our body starts to produce a hormone called insulin. Actually, an organ called pancreas produces insulin. That insulin also moves into the bloodstream. Okay. In a normal person, when the glucose and an insulin present in the bloodstream, that helps the glucose to move into the body cells. So it's not enough to have glucose in our blood to be able to feed our cells. The glucose also needs to be transported from the blood to our cells. So the insulin is a hormone. It's a special chemical that our bodies produce that moves the glucose into the cells so our cells can make energy. In a person with type 2 diabetes, there will be a resistance to insulin, so that even though the person's body is producing insulin, it is not able to move the glucose into the body cells. So even though a person is eating sugar, he's eating the glucose, he or she eating the glucose, that glucose is not moved out of the bloodstream into the cells. So what happens is that if you test your blood sugar, he's testing it with a special pen here, you will see that the blood sugar is high because there's too much glucose inside of the blood vessels. It's not being moved into the cells. If the glucose is moved into the cells, there's going to be lower glucose inside of the blood vessels. So the cells are starving. Even though there's glucose in our blood, the glucose is not able to reach the cells, and that is called type 2 diabetes. So in type 2 diabetes, a person's brain could be deprived of glucose, it could be deprived of energy, and it could cause a person to feel dizzy, faint, and even go in a coma in a really extreme situation. Type 1 diabetes is different. Type 1 diabetes happens because a person's body is not able to produce insulin itself. So type 1 diabetes people are usually born with. It's kind of like a condition that could be inherited from from our ancestors, obviously. And a lot of times you see the child here illustrated because type 1 diabetes shows up in your childhood. And type 1 diabetes is sort of like an autoimmune disorder, is where the healthy pancreatic cells that produce insulin are destroyed by the immune cells. So there's not enough insulin produced. If there's not enough insulin produced, the body's not able to move glucose into the cells. So people with type 1 diabetes will need to inject synthetic insulin into their blood after a meal if the blood glucose level is high. So if a person ate a meal, they tested their blood, they see that the blood glucose level is high, they will inject the insulin into their bloodstream to help their body to move glucose into the cells so the cells can make energy. And that way, if a person does not get their insulin, they could go in a coma and die from that, because we need glucose to feed our cells. Diabetic shock is when a person's cells are not receiving glucose. That means the blood sugar is high, but the body cells are not receiving the fuel they need to make energy. The symptoms of the diabetic shock is lightheaded, so feeling faint, dizzy, and shaky, like as if we're feeling when we're starving actually. Drinking a high sugar beverages can help relieve the symptoms.